Welcome everyone to Discover This. Well, today we're going to talk about the Old West. Some of you may be familiar with the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, and some of the names from the Old West. You know, Wyatt Earp and his brothers, Bat Masterson, Bass Reeves, Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, Wild Bill Hickok, and others. But today we're going to talk about a guy by the name of Buckskin Frank Leslie. And he was quite the character in and around Tombstone. And we're going to talk about his life and the mystery surrounding him. So let's get to it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Nashville Franklin Leslie was born near San Antonio, Texas on March 18th, 1842. Although that may not be correct. There's a conflicting account that he was also born on that date in Galveston, Texas. And he also sometimes claimed he was born in Virginia. And at various times he listed different people as his father and mother. So there's not a real good accounting of where he was born, maybe even exactly when he was born. On a couple of occasions, Leslie told some pretty tall tales of his growing up and what he did, none of it being confirmed. In 1878, when he was 36, supposedly, he was documented as being in San Francisco. He was a barkeeper, and he worked at a couple different bars from 1878 to early 1880. And that's pretty well documented via payroll ledgers and things like that. Now, Nashville Franklin Leslie left San Francisco in early 1880 and moved to Tombstone, Arizona. And he arrived in Tombstone, Arizona wearing buckskin clothing. The kind that scouts would wear back in the Old West. The kind that Wild Bill Hickok wore. He soon traded that clothing for finer clothes like what he wore in San Francisco. But he did wear a buckskin fringed vest. He was soon known as Buckskin Frank Leslie. In Tombstone, he partnered with a gentleman by the name of William Knapp and opened up the Cosmopolitan Saloon next door to the Cosmopolitan Hotel, which was at 409 Allen Street in Tombstone. Frank Leslie had earned a reputation as a gunfighter along the way. In fact, he would sometimes show off his shooting skills in the ceilings of the various saloons along Allen Street. Wyatt Earp once said that Frank Leslie was the only man to compare to Doc Holliday's lightning-fast speed with a gun. There's also a story out there that when in Tombstone, Frank Leslie and Doc Holliday had a confrontation, and when Frank Leslie drew down on Doc Holliday just walked away. Now, Buckskin Frank was attracted to a chambermaid at the Cosmopolitan Hotel by the name of Mary Jane Killeen, or May Killeen, as she was also known. She was married to a guy by the name of Mike Killeen. In fact, Frank Leslie attended their wedding on April 13th, 1880 in Tombstone, and Leslie is one of the two witnesses listed on the marriage certificate. On June 22nd, 1880, Frank was sitting with May Killeen in front of the Cosmopolitan Hotel. Soon a friend of Frank's, a guy by the name of George Perrine, saw Mike Killeen approaching the Cosmopolitan and yelled out a warning to Frank. Just as he yelled the warning, shots were fired and Frank Leslie was grazed alongside his head. Mike Killeen then attacked Frank Leslie, clubbing him with the butt of his gun, and the fight was on. Mike Killeen was shot and mortally wounded. He died 5 days later, but not before telling a friend that George Perrine had shot him, not Frank Leslie. Both Perrine and Leslie were charged with murder, but Frank Leslie told the judge that he had shot Mike Killeen in self-defense. The judge bought Frank Leslie's story, and charges were dismissed against both Frank Leslie and George Perrine. And Mike Killeen was buried in Tombstone's Boot Hill. And you can see on his marker that it says, "Killed by Frank Leslie." Well, that may not be factually true, but in the eyes of the court, since the judge believed Frank Leslie's story, that's the way the story goes now. 8 days after her husband's death, May Killeen married Frank Leslie in a ceremony at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. In May of 1882, a fire swept through Tombstone, destroying various buildings, including the Cosmopolitan Saloon. Frank and his partner, William Knapp, decided not to rebuild, and Frank ended up getting a bartending job at the Oriental Saloon in town. At the time, the Oriental was owned by Wyatt Earp. While at the Oriental, Frank Leslie badly pistol whipped a man in front of the saloon, and the town really started thinking he was a dangerous man. In November 1882, Frank Leslie was actually deputized by the Tombstone City Council, which gave him authority to arrest people on the premises of the Oriental Saloon. Now, unbeknownst to basically everyone, Frank Leslie also became an informant for Wells Fargo. Years after the fact, a Wells Fargo agent by the name of Fred Dodge said that Frank Leslie was actually offered a very large amount of money to kill Johnny Ringo. You see, Johnny Ringo had been suspected of robbing several Wells Fargo shipments. Now, on July 12, 1882, Ringo rode out of Tombstone and rode past the ranch of William Sanders. Sanders waved to Ringo and tried to have a conversation with him, but he said Ringo was really drunk. A few minutes later, Sanders saw Buckskin Frank Leslie ride past his ranch on the same road Ringo had traveled. To Sanders, it seemed Leslie was following Ringo. Later that same day, Leslie was seen riding back into Tombstone. Johnny Ringo was found dead under a tree along the trail he was riding on. Johnny Ringo was buried where he died, near Wilcox, Arizona, under the tree where he was shot and killed. And you can still visit that site today. It's on private property, but the owner lets you go back and see the grave site. Coroner ruled his death a suicide, but most people believe Frank Leslie murdered Johnny Ringo. One of the ones who firmly believed Leslie killed Ringo was Billy Clayborn. Clayborn was friends with Johnny Ringo and acquainted with Frank Leslie. Clayborn showed up to the Oriental Saloon one day when Leslie was bartending and started shouting and causing a scene. Other employees hustled Clayborn out of the bar, and he vowed to get even with Frank Leslie. Later that day, Clayborn showed up in the street outside the Oriental and called out Frank Leslie. Clayborn had a rifle, and Leslie took his Colt 44 and met Clayborn out on the street. Leslie told Clayborn not to fire his weapon, but Clayborn raised his rifle and fired at Leslie, missing him completely. Leslie pointed his gun at Clayborn and shot him in the chest. Before Billy Clayborn died later that afternoon, he told the doctor attending him that Frank Leslie had admitted killing Johnny Ringo. In another account, Billy Clayborn, on his deathbed, told the attending physician that he had seen Frank Leslie kill Johnny Ringo. And Billy Clayborn was buried in Tombstone's Boot Hill. In 1887, May Killeen divorced Frank Leslie. Among other issues with him, she was tired of him having her stand up against a wall while he fired shots at her, outlining her body. He did this numerous times, apparently, just to show off his skill. Not too long after the divorce, Frank Leslie started up a relationship with Molly Williams, a dancer at the Birdcage Theater. She was also known as Blonde Molly and Molly Bradshaw. See, she was the girlfriend of the Birdcage owner, E.L. Bradshaw. E.L. Bradshaw, upon knowing about the relationship, told Frank Leslie to stay away from the Birdcage. 2 weeks later, E.L. Bradshaw's body was found on a nearby creek bank, murdered by assailants or an assailant unknown. On July 10, 1889, Frank Leslie returned to his ranch drunk. He found Molly talking with a guy by the name of James Neal. Leslie reportedly shouted, "I'll settle this," and shot Molly, killing her. He also shot at Neal, hitting him twice and badly wounding him. Neal was able to escape. Frank Leslie was arrested later that afternoon, and Frank Leslie was held without bail. In January 1890, he pled guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison and was taken to the Yuma Territorial Prison, where he was prisoner number 632. Now, in November of 1896, So after only 6 years in prison, Governor Franklin of the Territory of Arizona granted Frank Leslie a full and unconditional pardon. Buckskin Frank Leslie left Arizona as fast as he could. Molly Williams is buried near what was the Leslie Ranch, where she was killed. And her marker's out there, basically in the middle of nowhere, where the ranch used to be. Leslie married again in Stockton, California in December 1896. And by March 1903, he was divorced again. He traveled around Texas, Mexico, possibly Alaska, and back to San Francisco. In the 1920s, Frank Leslie was living in Sausalito, and that's according to the 1920 census that documented him and his address in Sausalito. And that was the last known official documentation of Nashville Franklin Leslie, or Buckskin Frank Leslie. After that, there's no confirmed record of him. So in 1922, documents found on a body of a man who committed suicide in the hills east of San Francisco belonged to Buckskin Frank Leslie, reportedly. Those documents were never authenticated, and they weren't seen again. In the late 1920s, reports came from the Sierra Madres of Mexico that said Frank Leslie was in the area working as a ranch foreman. In 1933, reports came that Frank Leslie was in Alaska working mining claims. In 1947, a man going by the name of Barney McCoy was in a hospital in San Diego, California. Many friends came to visit him and would leave flowers and things like that. They came and went. Just before he died, Barney McCoy pulled his attending doctor aside and told him his name really wasn't Barney McCoy. It was Buckskin Frank Leslie, and that he had lived in Tombstone, Arizona for many years and killed a few men. And Barney McCoy is laid to rest here at Holy Cross Cemetery in San Diego, California. And unfortunately, he doesn't have a marker, which is interesting, I guess, but with the help of the cemetery staff, we were able to figure out where his body's located, and it's where this flag is right here. And we checked with the on the map they gave us, and he's right between Jerome Longpree and Luis Martin. So right here is where Barney McCoy, or possibly Buckskin Frank Leslie, is buried, here at Holy Cross Cemetery in San Diego, California. Then sometime in the 1950s, a strange letter was received by an unidentified man. The 3-page letter was postmarked Russellville, Kentucky, and detailed many of the events in and around Tombstone, Arizona in the 1880s. Events and very intimate details that only someone who was there at the time would have known about. The writer claimed to be 106 years old, and the letter was signed Buckskin Frank Leslie. Now, in the 1950s, if we believe that Frank Leslie's birth date is correct, he wouldn't have been 106 years old. So, but there's so much about his early years, you know, where he was born, and maybe even his birth date, who knows. But just another interesting story to go along with all the other stories about whatever happened to Buckskin Frank Leslie. All right, let's go back to the Barney McCoy story. And if we want to go down that road, and we believe Barney McCoy's birth date, and it's also claimed that he was actually born in Texas, which is where Frank Leslie reportedly was born. But Barney McCoy lived here at 41st and University. There's a vacant lot over there, and behind that fencing. And back in the 40s, there was a row of houses in there. And Barney McCoy lived at 4094 University Avenue in San Diego. And maybe that was the last address of Frank Leslie. But Frank Leslie's birth date, if we believe that birth date, and Barney McCoy's birth date don't align at all. But again, we have so much, there's just not enough information, especially on Frank Leslie. So is it possible that Barney McCoy was Frank Leslie? Maybe. You know, all these stories about this guy or that guy, or this letter or that letter was Frank Leslie. You know, it's kind of an obscure name to pull out of the hat. You know, obviously they all can't be Frank Leslie, but anyway, this is where Barney McCoy lived before he went to the hospital in December of 1947, and possibly where Frank Leslie lived till the end of his life. Now there's, if you like this story of Buckskin Frank Leslie, there's this book you can check out, buy, see if your library can get it. Might be worthwhile. It's got some good information. Again, his early life and his later life really aren't that well documented, but his tombstone years certainly are. So a historian, in looking over Frank Leslie's life, put together basically a summary. And he said Frank Leslie was a good shot, a mean drunk, fond of women, and a born liar. And that pretty much does sum it up. You know, his early years, we just don't have really any information until he was about 36 and he showed up in San Francisco. And then he's pretty well documented until the 1920 census, when he was back in San Francisco or living in Sausalito. And then absolutely nothing after that. Just conjecture, stories, things that were never proven, never followed up on. But that's the story of Frank Leslie. Buckskin Frank Leslie, Nashville Franklin Leslie. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I hope you check out some of our other videos. And we will see you next time on Discover This.